So we'd like to welcome everyone to this wonderful event, Cathonomics, celebrating the release of an incredible new book by Dr. Anthony Annett, by GU Press. We have a wonderful group of people to discuss this topic and all of the themes that emerge in this really, really rich interdisciplinary space. It's very appropriate that we celebrate Anthony Annett's work on St. Patrick's Day. So to all of our Irish friends out there, Anthony is Irish. And so to all of our Irish friends out there, we're really very, very happy to have this occasion. There are many, many reasons to celebrate, and we hope to open them out kind of one by one from a very rich interdisciplinary perspective. We're going to start with just a few words from Tony, who's going to share a little bit what motivated him to write this book, and then engage each of our fabulous speakers that I'll introduce one by one as we bring them in. But there's much more biographical information on the website and on the announcements for the program. I'm Amy Ullman. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center and also a lecturer at Georgetown Law School. I teach in the area of Catholic social thought, and so I'm just thrilled, not only for the book, but also for how this discussion today will open out this tremendously rich area for discussion. So just a reminder to everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and the caption video will be posted to the event page on the Berkeley Center's website soon. So if you registered for today's event, you will also receive an email with the captioned video when it becomes available. And then also reminder, you can feel free to share your questions as we go through. We'll dedicate about 10 minutes at the end for focus on those questions, but we'll also be keeping an eye on them as we go through, if we can weave them in as we proceed. So Tony, let's start with you. Just a very, very quick overview of what motivated you to write this book, and a few words about seeing this come into being and what it means for you today.
Thanks, Amy. And thank you, Amy and EJ and Christine and Kate, for honoring me today by being in this webinar on this book. I'm delighted, I'm honored, and I feel very privileged to do this. In response to Amy's question, well, if you had known me 20 or 30 years ago, you probably would have never predicted that I would have written this kind of book. Because I basically got my PhD in economics from Columbia University in 1998, and then I went straight to work at the IMF. And, you know, I grew up in economics in what I call the neoliberal 90s. It was kind of the zeitgeist as I was learning economics. When I was doing my PhD, I looked at the book on Catholic social teaching, and I thought that, you know, this is interesting, but it's a little bit naive. And that was pretty much my view back then. Everything changed for me after the global financial crisis, because from my perspective, this was not just a financial crisis, it was a crisis of ethics. And I started to diverge more and more from my fellow economists at that point. And that took me on a long journey. I started reading in much more detail about Catholic social teaching. I started reading about the Italian civil economy paradigm. And, you know, I began to realize that actually this is a huge corpus of wisdom that has a lot to instruct the global economy today, and is actually built on much better foundations than neoclassical economics. So, you know, that long and winding journey took me out of the IMF and into Cathonomics. So that's pretty much where it comes from. It was very much a lockdown project. I wrote this book during the first 6 months of the lockdown, when, you know, most of us were stuck at home with very little else to do. So that kind of kept me engaged and kept my sanity. So yeah, that's the genesis of the book and where it comes from, and kind of my background.
Beautiful, Tony. And so tremendous gratitude for maintaining your focus during lockdown, because the fruit of that labor is just extraordinary and so helpful. And also one of the things that struck me immediately was the interdisciplinary depth, and so the way that you hang together the moving parts of theology, economics, history, even psychology, are just an extraordinary contribution to the field. We'd like to get the conversation going with an exchange with Dr. Christine Hinze, and she's the professor and chair of the Department of Theology at Fordham, and also the emeritus director for the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, the author of a book called Radical Sufficiency. She was also my professor when I studied at Fordham, so I'm thrilled to be with one of my mentors, one of the mentors I hold very dear. And so, Christine, if you'd like to get us started with a few words, general impressions, and then this big picture question about the frame. Why in 2022 are we bringing the complexity of religion into a discussion of the good economy? What are the pitfalls? Don't we already have enough to fight over without bringing religion into this mess? And what are the benefits? And so a few words from you, and then maybe conversation with Tony on that.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with everyone. It's such an honor to be in this conversation. Amy actually set up that first question, which was one of my questions I'm hoping we can talk about, Tony. But first, let me say a couple words about reading this book as someone who works in the area of economic ethics from the religion side rather than the economic side. I'm so delighted at what I view as a very experimental book that you have here on this level. You have chosen to write a book that is filled with erudition. There's so much knowledge in the background of it, but you've written it in a way that is intentionally not just accessible. I mean, we all try to be accessible, but conversational. And I find that a really exciting feature of what you've chosen to do here. It's kind of risky, to put yourself out there when you're an expert who's worked for the IMS and to talk about economics and then religion in the way you do. And you do it in such a wonderful way. So I'm so excited to see how this book is received, and hopefully in much broader circles than a book that Kate or I, having EJ here is great because your work is bringing things out into the public, right? That are very difficult to explain. So I just think that's such a great feature of the book. We've already mentioned its interdisciplinarity. You're taking two complicated traditions, Catholic thought, religious thought, and Catholic social teaching, and then also the history of economic thought coming up to the present, and you take it all the way back. You talk about virtue ethics and Aristotle, and you also speak about, the pre-Enlightenment and then the Enlightenment paradigms and so forth. So you've got all this stuff in there, but again, in a way that's so readable and comprehensible. I don't have to know a lot about economics at all. I don't have to know a lot about religion at all to read this book, and I'm going to learn a lot. So as an educator, I'm really excited about the possibility of this being used in a number of different classrooms. I think that's probably enough to say at the beginning. There are a million topics that are worth talking about in this book, but taking it from the cue from Amy, maybe we can start by asking you to speak about this big question, like why bring religion into, you are an economist, you have an ethical sense and you've studied that. Why are you bringing religion into this? What made you choose to do that? What do you see as the possible, values or debits of writing a book that, even with the title you chose, right? I mean, and it's also that conversational type of title, but that, how will this affect your audience? And just to talk about this bringing religion into this discussion of economics and ethics.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you so much for the kind remarks about the book. I very much appreciate that. On religion and ethics, yeah, I think that there's a lot of discussion in the economics world right now about how economics needs a better grounding in ethics. There's books out there called Economics for the Common Good by Jean Tirole and people like that. And that's kind of what brought me here. It's where I started. But I find that, sorry, a lot of this debate is kind of very shallow. Some of it focuses a lot more on personal virtues like honesty, conscientiousness, reliability, thrift, the so-called bourgeois virtues. And there's little in the way of kind of the social virtues of justice and solidarity and reciprocity. And there's little in the way of kind of broader structural change in the economy of the whole. And this is where I think there's the great benefit of Catholic social teaching, because it offers a ready-made, sophisticated, and internally consistent ethical framework to discuss the challenges of the modern economy. And we have the papal encyclicals are a remarkable set of documents that apply timeless moral principles to very specific economic contexts, whether it's the Industrial Revolution of Pope Leo XIII in the late 19th century, to the global financial crisis of Caritas and Veritate of Pope Benedict XVI, all the way through the environmental crisis of Pope Francis in Laudato Si. So what I try to do in the book is I try to take those documents and distill a set of basic values or principles based on them, things like the common good, integral human development, integral ecology, solidarity, subsidiarity, universal destination of goods, the preferential option for the poor, rights and duties, notions of justice. All of these themes come out of Catholic social teaching. And you can stack these principles up against the principles of neoclassical economics, which are really based on the maximization of your subjective preferences through market competition and market interaction, guided by an invisible hand, whereby you're supposed to achieve societal well-being through self-interest. And I try to demonstrate in this book that actually the Catholic principles are much more concordant with human nature, and they're much more realistic, and they offer a much stronger guidepost to analyzing the challenges of the current economy, whether it's inequality or climate change or the future of work or ethics and finance or any of these big topics that are out there right now. So that's kind of why I delved into Catholic social teaching, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's already there, and it's not very well known, which is one of the great frustrations I have. But, it's a remarkable set of documents and principles. And that's kind of where I would go with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. That really captures, I think, one of the most helpful features of the book. And I have in my mind the chart actually that stacks up these principles. And it's this use of a comparative method, I think, that invites discussion in a thoughtful way with what religious principles also have to bring to our conversations about culture and getting beyond just the bourgeoisie virtues. That also sets us up really beautifully to bring in E.J. Dionne, who's a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center and a university professor in Foundations of Democratic Culture at Georgetown's McCord School of Public Policy and Government. And E.J. has thought long and hard about these questions, also from the perspective of how they relate to social democratic thought and other kinds of experiments in social democracy in other parts of the world. And so, EJ, you want to jump in at this point and tee up your impressions and also your questions for Tony. You're muted.
I think thinking long means I am getting old. It is so great to be here. I want to just happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. I just want to start by thanking Tony and the Georgetown University Press for publishing this book. For it personally, it was such a deeply reassuring and helpful book, because for years, I have tried to explain to people that I am a progressive, essentially a social democrat, because I am a Catholic. And that sounds mysterious to a lot of people these days, which is one of the things I want to get to. And Tony, in an extraordinarily rigorous, but extraordinarily understandable way, has laid out why Catholic social principles lead to something like what we would call social democracy. And that's where I want to take this discussion. I want to say if there's any person out there who wants to do a good deed, they might buy several thousand copies of this book and try to spread it around Catholic parishes in the United States and the world. Because one of the things I really would like Tony to talk about is why Catholic social thought is so unknown among rank and file Catholics. I have found this among students where in Catholic education, the principles of Catholic social thought, even the basics of solidarity and subsidiarity, are not widely known. I have a friend who taught in a Baptist seminary who said that one of the most exciting things she did, one of the most exciting classes she had every year, was to introduce her students to Catholic social thought, because she felt it was the most systematic application of Christian ethics to the economy that was available to all Christians. And by the way, for people out there who are not religious or Christian, I just want to report that my assistant, who is not particularly religious, let alone Catholic, found Tony's book so exciting. And I think it's very important that people of secular orientation take a look here, because I think these principles, while they are rooted in a religious tradition, have application well outside the framework of that tradition. So I want to pose a couple of questions to Tony. One is, our conservative Catholic friends have rightly criticized the most orthodox or extreme forms of Marxism for materialism. And yet what you bring home here is some of the most extreme forms of materialism are actually most exhibited by uncritical supporters of the market. Not that the market itself is automatically problematic, but worship of the market or market, what some have called market imperialism, sounds like a Pope Francis phrase, that is problematic. And you make very clear that the value of Catholic social thought against a purely materialistic view is that it speaks to the whole person, not just us as economic calculators, that people are embedded in relationships and obligations and communities, and that we have moral commitments as well as material commitments. So I'd like you to talk about that. I'd also like you to talk about what does Catholic social thought bring to the social democratic tradition that the social democratic tradition doesn't provide by itself? And how do the social democratic and Christian democratic traditions relate to each other? You talk about very powerfully about, if you will, the post-war economic settlement that got upset later on, which really was not just the creation, particularly in Europe, of social democrats, but a kind of shared understanding between social democrats and Christian democrats. And we also saw Christian democracy in Latin America in its heyday, with the early Eduardo Frei in Chile, for example, trying to bring these principles to bear in Latin economies. Could you talk about that a bit? And again, I just can't thank you enough for this book. I hope lots of people read it.
Thank you, EJ. Again, thank you very much for your kind remarks about the book. That's very much appreciated. Let me respond to your questions in a couple of parts. First thing I'll say is that, I wrote this book for a general audience. So I wrote it for Catholics, but I also wrote it for people who are interested in kind of a new economic paradigm. I wrote it specifically with the idea that you don't have to be Catholic. You don't have to believe in the God of Jesus Christ to accept these principles as guideposts for policy. So that was very much my motivation for writing it. And I hope it can reach a kind of a wider audience there. But I also hope it can reach Catholics, because I agree with you that there is a lot of these principles are not as well known as they should be, and I'll come back to that. But let me address your questions on social democracy, because I think this is a very important point. I think there was a very amazing period in Europe after the war, with the rise of both Christian and social democracy, because both free markets and various authoritarian economic structures were both discredited by the Great Depression and the war and the rise of totalitarian states. And here I'm guided very much by the great historian Tony Judd, who wrote the magisterial book Post-War. And in that book, he really expresses a great appreciation for the social democratic moment that arose in the post-war period. And he argues that in the area of economics, there was a really strong alignment between Christian democracy and social democracy. They all came to believe the same things. And actually, Christian democracy was closer to social democracy than it was to fascism or to free market economics or any of the alternatives. I also mentioned in the book the work of James Chappell, the historian, who wrote about the distinction between paternal Catholicism, which is focused on the family as the basic unit of society and the distrust of communism, and the more left-wing fraternal Catholicism. But again, like Tony Judd, I would argue that in the economic sphere, there's really strong alignment. So you have a lot of principles on basic income floor, basic social protections for workers, restraints on finance, support for collective bargaining, high taxes on high incomes. And that led to this remarkable period of strong economic growth, but also shared prosperity in the context of low inequality and strong financial stability. There were not major financial crises in the 30 years of the social democratic period. Now, where does Catholic social teaching differ from this? So I think there's a strong overlap, but I also think Catholic social teaching goes a step further in a number of ways. Catholic social teaching argues that going beyond the social democratic moment, there's a role for workers to share in both the profits and the management of the enterprise. So shared ownership and what Pope John Paul called the socialization of the means of production. That's not a theme we saw drawn out very strongly in social democracy. And I think a very strong element of kind of Catholic social teaching as it exists in Germany and some Central European countries is what's known as co-determination, which is worker representation on boards and work council at the level of the enterprise. Like in Germany, corporations with more than 2,000 workers have to have half the board of directors chosen by workers, which is kind of amazing. And that's a very successful experiment in Germany. I think the other difference is in the role of business. I think social democracy very much would argue that, or there's very much a kind of a tacit assumption, as it were, not a frontline assumption, but you basically let the market do what the market does, and the state can come in and clean up the mess. And that's very much agreed on the right and on the left. On the right, you have the kind of the Milton Friedman view that the only role of the business is to maximize profits identified with shareholder value. And social democracy is, again, let the market do what the market does, and the state will come in and protect workers from the vagaries of market fluctuations. But for Catholic social teaching, the focus is kind of different. It's basically that business, as well as the state, must be aligned with the common good. So the role is not just to make profits, it's to make, and I talk about this in the book, it's to make good goods, good work, and good wealth. So align yourself with the common good. So in these areas, I would argue that Catholic social teaching goes a step further than social democracy. And in a very fascinating book, Thomas Piketty wrote in Capital and Ideology, which is really his follow-up book to Capital in the 21st Century, which is his famous book from 1914. But he asks the question, why did the social democratic moment falter? And one of the reasons he gives is the inability of the German model of industrial relations to spread more widely. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing insight. And it's an insight that Catholic social teaching has to offer. And maybe as we go forward to kind of a renewed social democratic moment, there's an opportunity to kind of take a different direction when it comes to what the kind of policies you need for this new moment. So that's kind of how I would respond to EJ's question on social and Christian democracy. On the question of why Catholic social teaching is not more widely known, I'll give my view, but I'd very much like to hear EJ's view on this too, because he's been a columnist and a public intellectual for decades, discussing the role of religion and the economy and wider society. But my view is that in the US in particular, there was a concerted effort by a bunch of Catholic thinkers to try to align Catholic social teaching with a kind of a neoliberal approach to economics and a neoconservative approach to foreign policy. And I'm thinking of such thinkers as George Weigel, Michael Novak, the Reverend Richard John Newhouse, the people behind the Acton Institute. And so they align, from the 1980s onwards, they kind of developed this parallel track in Catholic social teaching, which argued that, well, free markets are kind of well suited. They're aligned with Catholic social teaching. And they kind of tried to use the thought of Pope John Paul II to try and bolster their interests. In my view, that was a failed experiment. They selectively quoted Pope John Paul II, and they unfairly treated his thought, in my view anyway. But the problem is a lot of these thinkers and worldviews have a lot of money behind them. Business likes to hear a worldview which says that the role of business is to maximize profits, and profit is a measure of kind of the social good. And so in that sense, you had this kind of a distortion here, and that was very much true in the United States. I think in Europe, the story is a little bit different. I think the story there is more about secularism and the idea that Catholic social teaching is kind of associated with antiquated, out-of-date views of the human person and the family, and it got all mixed up in kind of views of kind of sexuality and the human person, which again, I think was unfair, because I think its views on economics are much more communitarian and much less about individualistic. So I think, you have a kind of an individualistic approach on both the kind of to kind of sexuality and abortion on one side, but also on the other side, that very same libertarianism is used to push an economic agenda that's not really aligned with Catholic social teaching. So that's kind of my view. I don't, just to be upfront, I don't really go into that particular aspect of the history in the book, because I really want to restrict it to economics, and I didn't want to take pot shots at people. I wanted to present a very positive view of the economy. But since you asked, I figured I would answer as honestly as possible. Thank you.
Could I just say two quick things? I don't want to get in the way of Kate. The first is, just in fairness to those trying to get everybody to understand what Catholic social thought is, I have to shout out our friend John Carr at Georgetown, who has set up the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought in Public Life, precisely because he was concerned that the richness of the church's teaching on economics is not widely known. And he's done some great work over there. We can talk about the rest of it later. I'd only say I think there's a kind of break point in the leadership of the church in the United States, somewhere in the late 1980s, early 1990s, with the change of leadership, that if you go back to the bishop's letter on the economy back in the 1980s, it was a letter very consistent in broad terms with Tony's book. And I think that the church was broadly aligned with a kind of New Deal approach to economics from the 1919 letter on social reconstruction from the bishops, which really prefigured the New Deal, all the way through to the 80s. And I think there, for a variety of reasons, there was a shift that became increasingly sharp away from that earlier tradition. But we can talk about that later. But bless you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Let
me just echo Amy before. I fully agree with EJ's point about the amazing work that John Carr is doing. And as somebody once told me, I think there are people who don't go hungry tonight because of the amazing work John Carr has done over the decades. Yeah.
Amen. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to weave in one of the questions from our viewers who received a kind of critical comment of trying to explain the implications of Catholic social thought. That somebody said, this is a wish list and not a policy. And so I think one of the other reasons why it's difficult to get traction in conversations about Catholic social thought is there's a tendency to see it as very abstract. Like when you read the documents, the encyclicals themselves, especially for a pragmatic North American audience in particular, there's a sense that it's this declaration of abstract principles, and it's hard to see how they then weave into history and projects and cultural commitments and so on. And so I think one response is we need more books like Tony's, which help us nest the teaching within the broader literature. And also really, this is to build in another question, which is ethical frameworks generally also work with a set of moral principles. It's not like Catholic social thought is the only non-neutral perspective. And so this sense that it's a conversation between perspectives. And so to line them up, as Tony does, in a comparative way, is a way to invite deeper reflection on the implications of moral criteria generally. So with that, and actually this previous discussion builds a wonderful ramp into Kate's work. Kate Ward is an assistant professor of theological ethics at Marquette University. Her recent book is called Wealth, Virtue, and Moral Luck. Tony discusses Kate's work on inequality. And so Tony's previous comments about the role for workers and the way in which Catholic social thought goes further also sets up lots of reflection on what is good work and what is good work in the 21st century. And so with that, Kate, we'd like to turn it over to you and engage Tony on your questions as well.
Thank you. And yes, Tony, I as well thank you for the book. I can't wait to teach with it. One thing I appreciated that hasn't been said yet was the sense of urgency that I can pick up in you writing it, that people need to know this. Yesterday, the inadequacy of the neo-liberal approach to economics, the ways Catholic social thought can help. And I can't wait to show my students that this is an economist saying this, not a naive theologian like me. So it's so valuable. Thank you very much. So yes, so my question was about automation, and you help us see how the CST tradition is often suspicious of automation, especially when jobs are being lost because of the strong support for the dignity of human work, right? There's a human right to contribute to the common good through our work. So when jobs are automated away, Catholic social thought would have a sense that something is lost. But you also show us, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the modern globalized economy, where the good is many people leading better lives, healthier lives, longer lives. And I think automation has a part to play with that, a role to play in that, I think, if we're honest. So how can we think about automation for those of us who desire an economy that's attuned and geared to human flourishing?
Thanks, Kate, for that question, which is a very, very important question. Let me put my economist hat on just for a second, but I'll take it back off again in a few minutes, so don't worry about it. When we think about the economics of automation, I mean, there's been, as you said, there's been amazing changes in the workplace over the past 40 or 50 years, especially as robots and AI have replaced workers on the assembly line and in other parts of the economy. What does that do in terms of economic effect? Well, I think this is what it does if you look at the economics of it. The machines are replacing workers with lower skills, with high school diplomas or less. They are not replacing workers with college degrees or higher. So what's happening is you have a less demand for the labor of low-skilled workers, so their wages goes down. You have more demand for high-skilled workers, so their wages goes up. And capital is more productive, so the owners of capital get much higher returns and profits have soared. So you get this massive increase in inequality, especially wage inequality in the economy, but also an inequality between capital and labor, because the wage share of GDP has been falling while the capital share of GDP has been rising. So I think, this is a kind of it's an economic expansion. Overall GDP has gone up due to automation, but there's been an injustice. Certain sectors of workers are really suffering and they're losing out. And I think this is causing all kinds of social upheavals. It's leading to the infamous deaths of despair. And I think it's leading to the kind of political instability that we're currently seeing in the United States. But I would argue, I agree with Kate that I'm not sure the correct response is to fight the automation, because that's just going to happen one way or the other. And there are benefits from that, but it's to make sure that the benefits are shared fairly. And that comes back to the old social democratic policies, where the technological improvements in the post-war periods, and there were improvements there too, they were much more, they were shared much more fairly, and they were not hogged by a small number of elites. Now, this is a fascinating question, because in the book I quote an essay that was written by John Maynard Keynes, the most prominent economist of the 20th century. He wrote an essay in the 1930s called "The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren." And he argued that by the time of his grandchildren, which would have been in the 1980s, the economic problem is basically solved. In other words, we will all have enough income to all live with dignity and only work a 15-hour week. And of course, for Catholic social teaching, that kind of resonates with the idea of integral human development, where, we find meaning, purpose, dignity, and respect through our work, but we also need kind of more communal values and more to engage more in cultural and creative and family and care and spiritual activities, which these opportunities will give us. But this will not happen if we go on as we're going now, whereby Jeff Bezos can earn and Elon Musk can earn over $200 billion in wealth, whereas the people with high school earnings, high school degrees or less, have lower real wages than they did in the 1970s. This is a major injustice, and it's something that can be fixed with policy, but we choose not to do it. As with so many things in economics, and as why somebody mentioned the urgency of the book, one of the frustrating things for me is that a lot of these things are solvable with policy, but we choose not to do it. So yeah, that's, Kate, how I would answer that question. I know I'd like to hear what you have to say about this as well, since I know it relates to your work.
Yeah,
Could I say something just real briefly? One of my favorite stories in another book, because I'd like to create a dialogue between two books. The story is Walter Reuther, the legendary head of the United Auto Workers, was being given a tour early on. This would be in the 50s or 60s, of an automated plant. And the president, I think it was GM, said to Reuther, these robots won't be joining your union. And Reuther immediately said yes, and they won't be buying GM cars either. And I've always loved that story. But the book I'd love you to be in dialogue with, and maybe you could both promote each of your books. Congressman Ro Khanna of Silicon Valley recently wrote a very interesting book called Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Work Work for All of Us. And the premise is very much Tony's premise, which is you cannot stop all of this technological change in its tracks. The question is, how do you make technological change, some of which is marvelous and amazing, but how can you make this work for people and for parts of the country or the world where it's not working right now. And I just think there'd be a great dialogue. So maybe the two of you can do an event in Silicon Valley together.
Let's get Kate back in and Christine as well on this question of, I think what we're inching toward is how do we push forward this kind of really difficult cultural change? I mean, COVID demonstrated that we're all deeply connected, but the difficulties of the how we express that in these virtues of solidarity and justice has just proven to be so challenging in 2022. So Kate and Christine, do you want to both jump back in and flesh out some of those difficulties? What are the choices? And then we'll bring it back to you, Tony.
Kate, why don't you go ahead and follow up?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Tony. I think it's really helpful to put this in the context of integral human development, right? That it's not just about access to work as a human right, but also to leisure, to time with family. And those are all things that automation can help us access in a certain way. And well, Christine, I would have to say it's your work that's helped me see that, right? To see that automation, a strong state that helps make sure everyone has a floor, is something that is going to help people access leisure, but also time for the work that can't be automated away, right? Which is family care work, or we could also talk about creative work, the kinds of things. Both of these two came to the fore right during the pandemic. Everyone's doing a lot more care work at home, and everybody is relying on the arts for a lifeline in all our streaming TV, right? We need humans to keep providing those goods. They're very important goods. They're very meaningful. And yeah, I think that's a role where automation and distribution can really help more people access those things. So yeah, I'll toss that to you, Christine.
Thank you. Of course, I agree. And I think this is where another thing about the need for better education about Catholic social traditions and modern Catholic social thought is so, I agree, so urgent. And I take it, Tony, that the wider audience you're reaching for is obvious, but also there's this need for Catholics. We have 27, just as one example, Jesuit Catholic universities and hundreds of other Catholic universities in this country, and that there needs to be an educational pipeline for people to understand this more. But that's a broader point. About the issue of how we see work, Keynes's argument did not necessarily focus on the fact that, as Kate said, there's a lot of work that gets done that doesn't come into the GDP. The whole realm of family and neighborhood and civic engagement that all involves labor. That's also part of the right to work for folks. That's really deprived when people are making, have to work 3 jobs, come home exhausted, pick up something from the store, and that's their life, right? And then veg out on for the TV. So that the Catholic approach here, which overlaps with, and this is going back to the Sustainable Development Goals. You make those links between what's going on in the UN. Maybe you could say more about that, because the Sustainable Development Goals speak about, for example, gender equity and women's participation. And we all know that dealing with these non-waged elements or dimensions of the work world, home, neighborhood, and so forth, have a lot to do with gender and gender equity. So the importance of showing these to Catholic audiences, how these things then also link to the wider discussion that's going on in the UN and the sustainable. I think that's one of the important things you're doing in the book. So there's a lot there's a lot there for you to pick up. Care work women, this holistic view, even the living wage notion of John A. Ryan and the popes was about one income being able to support an entire family. So 35 to 40 hours a week should support a whole family. And then that links into the work spend cycle, right? That links into how consumerism has derailed even religious people. So yes, I'll stop.
Tony, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I can pick up there and jump in. Thanks, Kristen, and thanks especially for mentioning the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because they really lay out the contours of the global common good, at least in the material space, as opposed to the wider space of integral human development. And I should point out that the Vatican is deeply engaged on the Sustainable Development Goals. Pope Francis addressed the General Assembly on that morning in September 2015, when the nations of the world adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as a guide to economic, social, and environmental policy through 2030. Unfortunately, we're slipping in the Sustainable Development Goals. It's now 2022. We have 8 more years, and we're nowhere close to reaching those goals. I think COVID has really knocked us off track. The environmental stuff is also off track for a variety of reasons. But to shift back to, I think that Christine makes a very good point on the economics of care. This brings me back to, I remember listening to an interview with Felicia Wong from the Roosevelt Institute, and she called that President Biden's agenda a low carbon, high care agenda. And I thought that was a really good punchline, but it also, I thought, was deeply resonant with Catholic social teaching. Because of course, when we talk about care, we're talking about things like childcare, paid parental leave, elder care, all the stuff that's kind of standard in European social democracies, but is not standard in the United States. Of course, this relates to the future of work too. What will we be doing, as Kate pointed out, what will we be doing as robots take over more and more jobs? Under some estimates, 47% of US jobs are vulnerable to being replaced. And you know, as Christine says, a lot of these jobs are done by women. They're poorly rewarded for this. GDP has a problem accounting for the full extent of care work that's done. It's not always remunerated by the market. But you know, and I want to pay credit to Christine, who's done like really path-breaking work in this area. And you know, I think gender equity in general, especially in the area of economics, is possibly an area where there's room for Catholic social teaching to go further, especially in the earlier social encyclicals. There's very much an understanding that the woman's role is in the home, and it's the role of the man to provide for the family. And, you know, I think that we need a more holistic understanding of that today, that women do incredibly important work in the economy. They also do incredibly important care work, and that needs to be valued. Some people say the way to value that is through a universal basic income, which, as you know, Pope Francis endorsed that in his book, Let Us Dream, which was released at the end of 2020. That was a little too late to be included in my book because my draft was already in at that point. So maybe I would have taken a stronger position on the UBI if I'd read Let Us Dream beforehand. But I still am not convinced the UBI is the answer to everything. I think that we have the social democratic policies which have been tested and proven to work over the past, in the post-war period. And I think that we can extend those policies to the challenges of the future of work and inequality and all the stuff that surrounds that. Anyway, I'm talking too much. I want to hear from everybody else.
It's your book. Amy, could I ask Tony a couple of questions, including one that just popped up, I noticed in the chat?
Yes, go ahead,
but
EJ.
let me just, 3 questions, including that one. Question 1, we all would agree that in principle, Catholic social teaching is pro-family, but the pro-family-ness of Catholic thought has been almost entirely taken up with the church's stance on abortion, and also with sometimes its anti-LGBTQ teaching, or at least some would characterize it slightly differently than I just did. But I think, and yet progressive economics undergird the family, and that the whole part of Catholic social thought is deeply rooted in what does it take to keep families from being ravaged. How do we get from here to there? So that's one. The second is, I think we all know that, people who've studied Catholic social thought, if they know anything, they know the church teaches solidarity and subsidiarity. And solidarity, people sort of understand. Subsidiarity, I think, is widely misunderstood. It's often interpreted as everything should be done closest to the local, whereas real subsidiarity is it should be done at whatever level is most effective, consistent with local control. I'd love you to talk about that. And Ann Emerson asks, I think, an important question on the chat. If social equity needs more and more government intervention, what are the risks of greater government power, especially in the US where citizens oppose it? And I've always found that Catholic social teaching is powerful because it accepts the responsibilities of the state to social justice, but actually also puts limits on state power, that it has actually a balanced view of the state's role. And I've thrown three quite diverse questions at you. You can skip any of them, but I just wanted to toss them at you if I could.
Tony, I'm going to further thematize and complexify the questions too, because I think what's showing up in the chat is this, in the questions that are submitted, is this tension that there are these enormous problems that we need to pull together as humanity in order to survive. Right. And so early on, there was also a question about the economic sanctions in Ukraine. We have not spent a lot of time talking about the environmental crisis. And so this huge tension, seeming tension, maybe creative tension, unity of opposites tension, as Pope Francis might put it, between the deep solidarity that we need in order to face these enormous problems of humanity, together with the desire to humanize the process for addressing that through the value of subsidiarity as well. And so let's, if you want to jump in on that, answer all of EJ's questions in 2 minutes or less. And then let's also bring back Kate and Christine to sort of further flesh out also this question of the cultural challenge of how do we get from here to there in terms of addressing these types of enormous challenges that humanity is facing. So Tony—
By the way, in defense of Tony, there's a whole chapter called Care for Our Common Homes.
Yes, oh no,
climate is in here,
right.
Everybody.
Tony did not neglect the environment. So let's leave a little airtime for the environment in this as well. So go ahead, Tony.
Okay, let me try and remember the various questions from EJ and Amy. So first off, I agree with EJ that, you know, if you want to be pro-family, you need a more holistic set of policy prescriptions. In my view, if you're really pro-life, that means you're pro-family, you're pro-protecting the poor, and you're pro-fighting climate change. That's all part of the same pro-life agenda, in my view. And this is why I think we need to protect families through things like paid parental leave and childcare and enough income support for families. I think it's amazing fact last year that the child tax credit reduced child poverty by 40% in a remarkably short period of time. That just tells me very clearly that poverty is a policy choice. We can abolish poverty. We choose not to do it, and we're choosing not to extend the child tax credit right now. Moving on to, again, I agree with EJ on subsidiarity. It's the most misunderstood and the most, I would say, distorted, sometimes willfully distorted principle of Catholic social teaching. And I like the way Pope Francis described that. It's kind of a movement from the bottom to the top, but also from the top to the bottom. So, or I like the definition that our friend Megan Clark gives, which is you do things at the lowest level possible, but the highest level necessary.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. And I think sometimes that level is the global level, which ties back into the environmental crisis. As we know, a few months after the Sustainable Development Goals were endorsed in September 2015, the nations of the world gathered in Paris in December 2015 to come up with the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which said we need to take urgent action to stop global temperatures rising above 2 degrees Celsius or hopefully above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, that is a global challenge. The climate does not respect national borders or local borders. So this is a global challenge. So subsidiarity says this should be done at the global level. And I think that there needs to be, in my view, there should be institutions with much stronger teeth for monitoring and enforcing the decarbonization agenda of the major countries of the world. I propose something in the book along the lines of, you know, the IMF, my old institution, is kind of a peer review of countries' macroeconomic and financial policies. It would be nice to have a global organization that does a peer review of countries' environmental policies to apply peer pressure to urge action on climate change and other environmental issues. So yeah, that's okay. So I've tied in family, subsidiarity, and the environment. Am I doing okay, Amy?
That was amazing. Kate and Christine, jump in. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kate.
To the question of the feasibility, right? How do we advance the Cathonomics agenda? I think the family stuff is just so broadly popular. And now we've seen with the COVID relief that it's actually feasible. And we're also seeing in these years how public school is where the state touches families' lives, and there's a political battery there ready to go off when changes are made that people don't like. So I think if we can promote positive policies that help families, that's a winner. You know, why that isn't being done more, gosh, that's not my expertise, but I wish it were, and I'll always support it when it is.
Yeah, and just to build on that, you know, why is that happening? It's sad that maybe not surprising that the family becomes such a battleground, political battleground, right, for culture wars. So just to shift over to Amy's asked about the culture a couple times. So to what extent, I'm just interested in your thoughts, Tony, to what extent does moving in the direction that Catholic social thought and the SDGs point require shift of culture? In a way, we're talking about a shift of mindset, right? We're trying to get people to see the world in a different way, to react in different ways, and to just have a different frame. I guess I'm wondering, I always wonder about this, how does that change happen? At the very end of your book, you say, you know, it'll be from the bottom up. But of course, as you just said, it's obvious that there's many levels at which this has to take place. And then also for people, anybody, our students, all of us, as agents, like where do you throw your shoulder against the tide? You know, where are the places that cultural change, what is the role of cultural change? That's one question. And then in what ways can this cultural change be advanced even by ordinary people, you know? So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think that Pope Francis has this great phrase that he uses a lot, called one is time is greater than space. And I interpret that as you kind of need patience. You need to do things slowly, because the neoliberal era did not come into being overnight. There was decades of planning and decades of strategy by a lot of libertarian economists, a lot of business leaders, to kind of overthrow the social democratic, the New Deal era. And that reached its apotheosis with the rise of, say, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. But the groundwork was definitely laid in the 60s and 70s with the rise of the Mont Pelerin Society, the group of very powerful libertarians, and a shift in business towards a view that things in the country were getting a little out of control and need to be reined in. And, you know, that was quite successful. So I think that, you know, we're at this hinge moment right now. We are in the middle of an economic dislocation. We've talked about that already. We're in the middle of a social crisis. Life expectancy among key demographics in the United States is actually declining. Communities are being hollowed out, and that's leading to a political crisis. We're seeing a lot of backlash against less trust in institutions. Trust and social cohesion are at all-time lows. So we're at this real hinge moment. And that's kind of really why I wrote this book, because I think that Catholic social teaching can offer a way out, but it's not going to be overnight. I think we need to take the message to whoever is receptive to that message. And yeah, at the end of the book, I did say that, you know, we need to listen more to the people at the bottom. And that really follows, well, again, I'm following the example of Pope Francis, who said we need to go to the peripheries. And, you know, some of his most powerful speeches and statements were to the popular movements, which is really groups of the poorest of the poor, especially in Latin America, but also in other countries of the world. And, you know, he calls them social poets, which I think is a beautiful phrase. And, you know, he very much sees that it's only from the bottom up that we can have this change. But I also think there's, you know, Pope Francis says reality is more important than ideas. And it's kind of ironic that I use that phrase, given that my book is full of ideas. So yeah, I think, you know, we need to push on whatever areas we can. And I don't, you know, there's no, I wish there were an obvious solution, but there isn't. We just have to keep on pushing. Yeah, I'm curious to hear other people's views on that.
From the chat, from the questions that are submitted, I think we need a symposium of about 3 weeks to be able to adequately even do minimal justice to the wonderful questions that have come in. But we are just about at time. I wanted to just suggest one more phrase of Pope Francis, which is to initiate processes rather than occupy spaces. And to me, that also suggests, looking at the 3 professors, 4 professors on this panel, that also suggests our commitment to education. And so thinking deeply about, well, first of all, the gratitude for what a book like this brings into our different teaching spaces. Because there was a question here of where do we start in this huge library of resources? I'd say start with this book. I mean, it really summarizes in an incredibly compact and accessible way the heart of the tradition. And so perhaps one future symposium, hopefully even in person at some point, we can also talk about what this book means for teaching in this space, and how it might change some of our curricula and our possibilities with that. But we are at time. I don't know if Tony, you have one more word of closing, or any of our panelists, anything that you weren't able to, an idea that emerged to kind of give a flash insight into, pointing to future conversations, and then we'll give the very last word to Tony. Kate, Christine, EJ, any last word?
Well, I just wanted to read from Tony, if I could, because Tony is a humble man. He doesn't toot his own horn. And so I just wanted to draw on the end of the book. And by the way, there is a 17-page bibliography here. So if anybody wants to study this deeper, after they read Tony's book, they got one heck of a reading list at the back of the book. But I just liked, where he closes, changing the global economy along these lines is not going to usher in utopia, which I actually think is important, because I think Catholic social teaching is not utopian. It just makes things better. It doesn't pretend to make them perfect. But I do believe it can eradicate the worst excesses of neoliberalism, not only on the economy and society, but on human psychology too. My basic contention is that neoliberalism inculcates and amplifies the wrong values. It is time to try something different. It is time to reform systems of education, especially in the domains of business and economics, spoken as a good PhD in economics. Ultimately, what is at stake is not just the health of our economics and societies, or indeed personal happiness and flourishing, but peace itself. And the last words, change is coming, but it is coming from the bottom, not the top. Let us hear and respond to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and let us build something better. God bless you, Tony, for trying. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ.
Thank you, EJ. That was a great idea to conclude with Tony's own words. Kate or Christine, any other last comments?
Just very quickly to thank you so much again, but also to say that one of the takeaways for me is everybody has a role to play in their own areas of agency, in their own areas of expertise in moving this and making this change possible. And the book gives a lot of great tools and resources for those who want to understand more about how to move forward, but everybody has a role to play. So thank you for that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christine. Kate?
Yes, and I think people will pick this up who would not pick up a papal document or will not be hearing a sermon on CST at church. And I do think the principles in themselves are intelligible and clear, and people can connect them to their own lives and their spheres of influence. And you've really helped them do that. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Tony, last word to you.
The last word I'll say is, well, first of all, thank you all for the kind remarks about the book. I'm just humbled and you know, thrilled. But I would, since Amy, you brought up the education thing, I would just say that, you know, the Jesuit business schools are undergoing a kind of a major curriculum reform right now to try and align the values with more humanistic values in Catholic social teaching. And I'm kind of involved with that in the area of economics. I'm currently teaching a class at Fordham, which is kind of a new approach to teaching economics. It's very much an experimental class, but it's, you know, along the lines of Cathonomics. So yeah, so there is movement in this area, and I'm glad to point out that the Jesuits are leading it. So yeah.
I can feel a set of conferences cooking as we start to hope to open up and be together in person very soon. So thank you to each of you. Thank you again to GU Press and to the Berkeley Center for bringing us all together, and happy reading for all of you who have not had the opportunity to dig in yet. It's a beautiful read, and have a wonderful rest of the day.